Okay, so we start here the recording. And I would like to welcome you all to the 20th meeting of the Animalia study group. We're very happy to have you all here today, not only because we have this special guest here, Flint Devo, with us, but also because we are celebrating our 2nd anniversary as a group. So that I remember that on the 2nd of October 2019, we had our first online meeting before the pandemics and everything, and we were already online. And we kept off with our commitment to study relationships between animals and human beings in antiquity. We've read and discussed many topics, from literary depictions of animals, many different animals in Greek and Roman works, ancient sacrifice, animals and evolution, there's vegetarianism in antiquity, a lot of vegetarianism is going on around here, among other topics. And we are happy to say that we gathered like this small but very engaged and international community of students, researchers, and professors in a multidisciplinary group with ancient historians, classicists, philosophers of antiquity, and even one paleontologist, my best friend there, André. And this semester, we decided to delve a little bit in the discussion about zooarchaeology and human anthropology, especially because we recognize the importance of working with material culture for a better understanding of social phenomena and performance, such as sacrifice, eating habits, and also abstinence. That's why we invited Dr. Flint Devo to offer us an introduction to the zooarchaeology in ancient Greece, and also to discuss some of his papers, especially his work in Azoria about the sacrificed animal bones lying everywhere, not only in temples. So I'll proceed to a presentation of Dr. Devo. He's an archaeologist specialized in zooarchaeology. He holds a PhD from University of Cincinnati, was a postdoctoral research fellow at the American School for Classical Studies at Athens, and is currently Marius Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Cardiff University. His research focuses on food from the classical Greek world. He has participated in many field projects in 7 different countries, spanning from the Paleolithic through medieval periods. He's interested in developing innovative methods in digital humanities and is also very active in public engagement and outreach. His current research project is Zoocrete, the Zooarchaeology of Historical Crete, a multi-scholar approach to animals in ancient Greece. He's also a senior staff member of the Azoria project, directed by Donald Haggis. We are very happy to have you here, Flint. Thank you for coming. And now you have the floor. Please feel free.
All right. Thank you for having me. I think one of the best things about the proliferation of Zoom is being able to chat with people from everywhere. And so I'm very thankful that Pedro invited me, and I'm glad to share some of my research here. I should state for the record that actually all my degrees are in classics, and I came into zooarchaeology kind of along the way. And it's not very easy to study zooarchaeology from classics departments, at least in the US. And so the Cincinnati actually had to help pay for me to go to Sheffield, where they have a strong zooarchaeology department that's under threat right now. But they were traditionally strong to receive this kind of training and to be able to try to apply these kind of archaeological science methods to sort of classical studies and the study of the past. So I come at this from a sort of defensive angle because in the US, there aren't many people that do what I do and study ancient Greece. So I'm here to try to sell to you all why we should pay attention to animal bones and why they have something that I think at least is interesting to say about animals and humans in the past. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to try at least. There we go. All right. Is that good for everybody? Pedro, do you want to give me a thumbs up?
It's great.
Okay. So yeah, so let's think about the zooarchaeology of ancient Greece and what we can say sort of big picture and small picture from animal bones themselves. And I want to start off with a little story. 2 years ago, almost to the day, I gave this talk in Athens called Goats and Other Animals at Azoria, Public Feasting and Domestic Dining in Context. And so to illustrate the talk, I sent out a call on Twitter for goat pictures from anybody out there. And immediately people that I know from Greece, archaeologists, replied with some stunning goat photographs. And I was pretty pleased. I was like, all right, we're set with goats in Greece and nearby countries. But then I started getting goat pictures from all over the world. because everybody has a good goat picture. They're sort of taken over the internet. And I'll come back to this story in a second. But I started gathering these from archaeologists, and then zooarchaeologists leapt in because they study animals. So of course they follow these animals closely in the environment, and they sent me all their favorite goat pictures. I think this guy's a bit of a wizard with these horns here. And then beyond that, I started having herders, people that actually own goats. They saw this call as it went more and more viral, and sent me in photos of their goats that they raise. And it went even kind of beyond this point until the animal scientists hit it. And so I started getting all these photos from animal scientists just framed for their research and things like that. And besides the fact that these are some great goat photos, my real point here is that I probably have the best collection of goat photos in the world. So this is one of the perks when we study animals. We get to look at these animals today and try to connect them. And I think these kind of photos will help add some flavor to the talk here. But returning to the bones, my research focuses on how we can integrate animal remains with sort of more traditional evidence, texts, art, sculpture, these kind of things that have been studied for hundreds of years. But at least in the historical Greek world, so after the Bronze Age, there really is not that many studies of animal bones, and they're very rarely cited in classical historians and classical archaeology literature. And so it's good because I have this amazing context of the text and the history and the philosophy and the artistic representations of animals within which to fit these animal bones. But to do that has its own set of challenges as well. And so I'm hoping we can sort of think about those. And I want to emphasize that this is really mostly my own research projects that I'm putting together. And the reason why is until recently, the animal bone studies in ancient Greece focused on taxonomy. They counted bones and then said, we're counting up the number of sheep or cattle or pigs or dogs or horses at a site. And so that's very valuable. And I'll look at, published data and fit it into mine. But most of the time, the published data I can work on mostly relates to taxonomy. So counting the counts of species. On the other hand, there's a lot more that we can say. I've developed this digital database to record animal bones in a sort of GIS system where we can record cut marks on an anatomical representation of the bones. And then I can export that to GIS software and get kind of a heat map of different kinds of cut marks on the carcass of an animal. And so this is one of the reasons I'm going to focus on some of my own data and some of the sites that I've studied more closely, like Azoria that Pedro mentioned. And so the three sites I'm going to focus on is Nicoria first, and that's late Bronze Age through early Iron Age settlement. It actually starts in the Middle Bronze Age in Southwest Greece to sort of get a head start into the period that I think most of us are interested in, which is a little later on. And then I'll move to Azoria, which is predominantly an early Iron Age through Archaic period settlement. And then I'll move to the Athenian Agora, so the center of downtown Athens, so Archaic and Classical Athens. And we can get a sense, I'll try to build in other studies as well to get a sense of how zooarchaeology can illuminate what we study in these kind of contexts, and why also zooming in on a particular sites is very valuable. It gives us a lot of detail that we can't always ask of the larger picture. So we're looking at animal bones, teeth, and horn core in a sense. I'm going to focus on the primary domesticated animals, so sheep, goat, pig, and cow, because that's by far the vast majority of animal bones I come across. I think there's a lot interesting to say about other kinds of animals, but I think it's good to get a big picture with what we have the most of first. So if we start off with the late Bronze Age, you're going to see a few of these graphs here, and they're all going to look the same with the same color coding. So it's a proportion of animal bones at a site from these four taxa. In yellow is the proportion of them that are cattle, blue pig, light green sheep, dark green goat. Sometimes specialists do not distinguish sheep from goat, and in which case it's going to be more of an in-between green color. You don't see it on this graph. Because this graph's more up to date, I guess, with the studies that are done. But when you start off in the late Bronze Age, what we see is that the most common animal at most sites is sheep. It looks very homogeneous in a sense. Most of the sites seem to have fairly similar taxonomic compositions, so proportions of these different species. And so this is kind of interesting that we have all these sheep here, and it's not easy to distinguish sheep from goats. So it's good that scholars have started to report that more to give us this sense that sheep are very common in the late Bronze Age in the Greek world. Now, one of the things this might relate to is the linear B tablets, where there's thousands of them, particularly from Knossos, but from other sites as well, that talk about large herds of sheep that are managed and raised for textile production. And so it's possible that this preponderance of sheep in the animal bone record relates to what we have from these documentary texts that were sort of, if you don't know about them, they were sort of frozen or fired accidentally when palaces and other structures were burned down. So they're kind of receipts of goods in and out and of herds that are owned and of different crafts and things like that. And so it's documentary textual sources, and there are a lot of sheep mentioned in them. So if we sort of zoom in on Nicoria to get a more in-depth look at what's going on, it's interesting to see these changes in taxonomic composition over time. Nicoria was originally famous for the shift to cattle at the end of the Bronze Age, and that's why I went to study it for my PhD. But what I'm interested in first, I'll get to that in a second, is this shift towards sheep becoming the most common domesticate in the late Hellenic III period, which is the period when Nicoria becomes under the control of the Palace of Nestor at Pylos. And at the same time, if we look at the ages of slaughter, what this is it's representing the herd at 100%. When it's born, 100% of the animals are alive. And with each year going by, fewer of the herd is alive based on the proportions of slaughtered animals that we can age. And so what we can see is at the same time, between the LH2 and the LH3 period, the slaughtering ages get slightly older. And so this might be indicative of animal husbandry that's geared more towards wool production, as you would keep males alive later in their lives if you're going to focus on wool with sheep herds. And so it does seem as if we see this change at Nicoria that matches what we would expect from the linear B tablets. And there's a couple other sites that have now been published on Crete, Mochlos, and also at Knossos, which track this increased age of slaughter for sheep that suggests some more emphasis on wool at this time. So this might help us start to explain the sort of predominance of sheep, preponderance of sheep, I suppose, this homogeneous set of animals that we see in the late Bronze Age. It relates to what we have in the textual record at the time in the linear B tablets. Now, the site of Nicoria is famous because it was one of the first sites excavated back in the 70s using scientific methods and recovering animal bones. And they noticed this stark shift towards cattle in the early Iron Age, which was actually why I went to restudy it. And my restudy showed that, yes, cattle do increase in the early Iron Age. So what's going on here? The traditional explanation for this is, we've all read our Iliad and Odyssey. These heroes feast on a lot of cattle. There's a lot of cattle eating in the Iliad and the Odyssey throughout. And so maybe this is what's showing up in actual life. And so scholars for a few decades interpreted this. They interpreted the people at Nicoria as shifting from agriculture to pastoralism. And they described the people living there as a band of pastoralists and hunters, and probably also warriors, led by Basileus, robbing cattle from their neighbors and feasting at the great house at Nicoria. And Anthony Snodgrass summarized this in his book, An Archaeology of Greece, as this kind of pastoral hypothesis, where in the early Iron Age, after the collapse of the palatial society in the late Bronze Age, settlements and society moved to emphasize pastoralism. And he used these key pieces of evidence, including cattle ranching at Nicoria, to support that. Over the years, scholars have criticized this. Decrease in settlements is not necessarily explained by pastoralism, neither is ephemeral structures nor handmade ceramics. And so over the years, it was this assemblage at Nicoria of all these cows that made people think that this was a pastoral society. With my more closer look at the bones, using more modern methods, what I paid attention to is taphonomy. And in the early Iron Age layers, which are above the late Bronze Age layers at the site, they're closer to the surface, they're more exposed to rainfall over the millennia. The bones in those layers are very badly preserved. And so it seems to me that this increase in cattle at Nicoria, which has sort of fed this pastoral hypothesis, is probably based off of a biased data set. Cattle have much larger, more robust bones than smaller animals like sheep, goat, and pig. And that's why they survive better in this environment in the early Iron Age soils at Nicoria. It has to do with the soil profile. So I want to throw out that cowboy hypothesis now, that pastoralist hypothesis, partly also because it doesn't match our evidence from human remains. So you can do isotope analysis on human remains to give a sense of how much animal protein people are eating. And by and large, in the early Iron Age, these physical anthropologists and bioarchaeologists have published that animal protein consumption actually drops at this time in the early Iron Age. So it doesn't look like they're becoming pastoralists. So what is going on? This is what we can say, is we have now, it looks very different from the late Bronze Age. All these different sites, at different sites, different animals are the most common one. And so to me, this seems more heterogeneous than I meant to have a graph of the late Bronze Age in here. Where is it? So this looks very homogeneous, this late Bronze Age graph, where most of the sites have a similar taxonomic composition. If we go to the early Iron Age, on the other hand, it's much more heterogeneous. So why does that matter? How can we explain it? Sorry, I'm going to jump back. One of the other things we can try to connect this pattern to is we have growing evidence that the climate is changing around this time at the end of the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. Specifically, it's getting drier. And so this has become a very trendy topic where people start to argue that climate changes, that causes the collapse of palatial society. But that's a problem. Climate change doesn't cause all these palaces to burn down. We need to understand whether it's impacting food production, because that would be the explanation for climate change impacting these societies. So the other issue we have is that we don't know exactly how much the climate changes, and we only have a few proxies throughout the Greek world. So we don't even understand where it changes in more precise detail. And so in order to do that, what we can do is we can build in food waste, this evidence for food production and what's going on, to understand if humans did respond to climate change. Was it enough of a change in precipitation to actually affect society? So we have this very homogeneous sort of taxonomic composition of species in the late Bronze Age, and then this heterogeneous version in the early Iron Age. So one of the ideas that we could start thinking of is maybe different. We know that the landscape of Greece is very broken up, different mountains, different upland plateaus, valleys. Each of them has their own sort of micro region. Well, it would make sense then for different settlements to adapt to climate change in different ways, because they exist in different points in the landscape, and they're no longer controlled by these larger palatial entities after all. And so when you sort of plot out these changes in the landscape, it seems like the sites that have shifted towards more goats from sheep are mostly in the east. And the relief of the Greek peninsula and Crete as well means that there's a lot more rainfall in the west today than in the east. It's about twice as much in the west versus the east. So in these areas where it was already dry, plus it's becoming even drier, it's interesting that they're mostly shifting towards goats, which could indicate that there's this kind of adaptation to climate change that takes several hundred years for these different settlements to start shifting to goats, but they all do if they're in the east. And so that also then feeds back into the idea that climate change impacted this transition at the late Bronze Age, because it was enough to actually, for humans to need to adapt to it and respond to it. So let's now zoom in on one of these goat settlements, as we can call it, and let's head to Azoria, which is located in eastern Crete. Now, in Azoria today, there are still a lot of goats. They're a real problem. They're everywhere in this landscape, and we just can't even keep them out of the site. It's actually become a legal problem because the excavation team could not keep them out of the site. And so this just gives you a taste of some of them we see normally and how they just kind of root through the site. And we had to set up a camera trap to try to figure out how they were getting in, for example, because they were damaging the trenches. Excavators would come back to trenches full of goat turds. It's not the most fun. And I've heard from other archaeologists around the world that they also struggle against goats as well. And the problem is you just can't keep goats out. That's what we learned, because goats will get in anywhere, anything. As a herder I know once told me, if you can throw a bucket of water at a wall, a goat can get over it because they can just climb on anything with their two toes. It's pretty amazing. So, all right, back to the bones. Let's think about Azoria again. So East Crete, it's located near the Isthmus of East Crete, and it has access to different upland plateaus and down even to the Lasiti Plain. It's actually a quite large settlement, and it's all been excavated primarily by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill under Donald Haggis. And most of this was excavated in the 21st century, except for just a small amount up on the top of the slope. And so there's been a heavy prioritization of more modern methods where we sieve for animal bones and we do flotation to collect seeds. And it really gives us a more complete picture of food, ways, and diet across this settlement, kind of at a higher resolution than you can get anywhere else in this period and region. And because the settlement's quite huge, and it's also develops at an important period. Our evidence mostly comes from sort of the late 8th through the early 5th century BCE. And so this is an important period of city-state formation on Crete and in the Greek world. And it's with our more recent methods that we have such a huge assemblage of animal bones and seeds. This number now needs to be updated. I've now studied even more than this, but it's pushing over 20,000 identifiable remains from about 200,000 total remains. And we need a large assemblage because it's so fragmented. This one colander is holding 1,000 bones. And we need to understand what's going on from butchery, burning, precise ages across this settlement to really get a detailed picture of the way animals are distributed to different people. And so we need this kind of large assemblage and intensive collection. But what's really useful is at this point in my study, I can sort of break it up into 5 large groups. Each of these groups has at least 1,000, usually 5 or 6,000 identifiable specimens. And so this includes an earlier temple, the Proto-Archaic building, at least we think it's a temple. And then from the late Archaic period, most of these assemblages date near the end of it. It's floor deposits from 5 houses, floor deposits from the communal dining building, which has a series of rooms where the citizens would gather to eat, we think, and then dumps and middens from the same building, as well as exterior spaces. I can start to compare and contrast across this site. And what's really interesting is the site was abandoned suddenly, around-ish 480 BCE. And the people left behind most of their ceramics. And so we've been able to mend a lot of these ceramics, hundreds, if not thousands of them, and to get a sense of where they're lying in these different structures as to how the space was being used. So we have storage areas, and not only do we have the storage vessels, we can tell which areas were holding olive oil and which areas were holding wine based on the plant remains. And then we have cooking areas where we have full cooking assemblages and hearths and things like that, that we can start to understand the use of space in more detail. And then we have these large middens up near the communal dining building, which just have, probably 10,000 total identifiable specimens I've studied at this point. So this is really useful to start looking at the use of space and comparing, say, what's going on in somebody's home versus what's going on in areas that citizens gather, where they gather. Now, I want to emphasize this is a goat site. Goats are the most common animal in every single phase, same kind of graph. But what we can do is start looking at other variables like burning. So interestingly enough, the area that has proportionally the most burned bones is that building that we think is a temple, the Proto-Archaic building. And I'll also talk about some of them these burned bones that comes from the house floors. So the running hypothesis is that this comes from sacrificial ritual, which I'll try to convince you of. I always try to doubt that at first because you can burn bones for a lot of different reasons. But with the Proto-Archaic building, it's this large complex that fronts on an earlier Tholos tomb that's right here. And it has this was at one point just one large room. This wall was built later, but the rest of this was one large room. And right outside of the building is what we call the pyre deposit. And it's fairly thick, 20 to 40 centimeters, and it's full of ash, and it's full of burned bone, and it's full of only drinking vessels and pouring vessels, all in fineware. So this contrasts very dramatically with what we have from elsewhere at this site at this time. A much larger proportion of the bones are burned, and instead of having coarseware pottery, we only have fineware pottery related to drinking. So that's one of our arguments, that this has to do with some sort of sacrificial ritual. Another one is that if we start plotting the burning anatomically across the bones, most of the burned bones come from sort of what we think of on a human skeleton is from the kind of elbow down or from the ankle down on the forelimb and the hind limb. So kind of less meaty parts. And about 80% of the burned bones come from sheep or goat, less meaty parts from the lower legs. And I get this pattern also. Occasionally we find these smaller assemblages from the houses that date a few hundred years later to when the site is abandoned around 480 BCE. And they also include mostly feet bones and occasionally some head bones. So some horn cores in this deposit on the right, which is from D1500. I don't know if it's labeled there. It's only left-sided goat metatarsals and right-sided goat horn cores. So it's kind of interesting, the selection of bones that they're burning there. In one case, we have a hearth in one of these houses, right as it's just abandoned. And right next to it, we have this concentration of burned bone that the excavators, they actually excavated a fully articulated and burned cow foot, which is also kind of interesting. And they're not like burned to a crisp, as you can see. Many of these seem to just be carbonized, which suggests to me they're only burned for a brief period of time. In another case, I have this kind of masonry bin that's made of stones, and inside I have a series of different burn bones and unburned bones. All the burned ones are fully carbonized, and in one case, these two ankle bones actually articulate while the astragalus is burned, but the calcaneus isn't. So again, it strikes me as somewhat intentional burning that's going on. Now, this contrasts with most of our sacrificial evidence from elsewhere in the Greek world. Most of the sanctuaries that have published zooarchaeological evidence for sacrificial ritual, most of those burned bones are either the thigh or the tail, or from one of the bones next to the thigh or the tail. And you see, for example, on Athenian vase painting, here's like a little sacrificial hearth. This thing curling right here, that's the tail of the animal. And so, you know, this was apparently good luck. Aristophanes mentions that in one passage. And who knows, to be honest, the tail always curls. It just contracts as it loses moisture. So I guess it's good to always have some good luck. But what we have, these lower legs, is very different from what most of the published evidence from sanctuaries shows. Now, most of the published evidence from sanctuaries, it relates very well to that artistic evidence, and it relates very well to our textual evidence from Homer down through Pausanias. Consistently, it is the thigh bone in general that is selected for burning in these kind of sacrificial rituals that are described in our literary sources. So what's the deal with all these kind of lower leg bones? It's something I've been thinking about for 10 years. So if people have any thoughts, I'm always open to it. But what I found through tracking through the literature and a couple of the other sites I've studied as well is that it actually is more widespread than it first seems at glance. We have evidence of it from the late Bronze Age at Eleusis and Ios Konstantinos. We have evidence at the very end of the late Bronze Age at Halosmenos, which I studied. It's nearby, near Azoria on Crete. As well, I studied a pit from Nicoria with this kind of pattern. And then Azoria, Komos, and it's also published at the Athenian Agora. So this is a legitimate pattern that's now starting to appear at multiple sites in multiple periods in the Greek world. What I think it relates to is this text from the Homeric hymn to Hermes, where Hermes, he steals Apollo's cattle and he walks them backwards to avoid theft, so nobody can track his footprints, the hoof prints of the herd. And then he sets out a meal for the 12 gods in 12 portions. And to clean up afterwards, he piles up the dry logs and destroys all the feet and head with the fire's blast. And then he also quenches the fire fairly quickly, covering the black ashes with sand. And that kind of event could explain the kind of ritual that I have. It's not always this completely carbonized thing that I showed you from the houses of Azoria. Sometimes they're much more heavily burned. But scholars of Greek religion have always seen this as kind of an inversion of sacrificial ritual. But as we build up our data set from the zooarchaeological record, I think it represents something that did happen as an etiology myth or otherwise. So what's going on with these sort of two different patterns? The thighs and the tails mostly shows up at sanctuaries, altars, temples, places like that in the Greek world, while the lower legs and sometimes heads mostly shows up in private areas with a couple temples. Only at Komos and Azoria are temples where they actually show up at. So there is this distinction in the kind of space where it's used. Or maybe one of the things I'm trying to think about now is to explore it more chronologically. So in the late Bronze Age, the burned bones that we have that seem to be intentionally burned, they vary from site to site. Sometimes it's, you know, mandible, humerus, and femur, like at Pylos. Other times it's lower legs. Other times it's that thighs and tails thing. In the early Iron Age and Archaic, it sort of contracts a little more into this kind of pattern that we have with sanctuaries mostly being thighs and tails, but a few have lower legs, while in more private contexts, it seems to be lower legs. But then by the late Archaic and Hellenistic period, sanctuaries stop burning these lower legs, at least the ones that have been published. So they seem to become more restrictive and strict in their observance of sacrificial ritual in sanctuaries, beginning kind of, classical period or so. While we still get these lower legs, sometimes in more private contexts, like houses at Azoria or houses at the Athenian Agora. So there might be some sort of change over time in how sacrificial ritual is conceptualized. And one of the things I'm playing with is I wonder if this actually has a knock-on effect from certain texts becoming very popular. Texts like the Iliad and the Odyssey, as they spread through the Greek world, they become used to explain ritual practice. And so seeing ritual becoming more restricted could be explained by the fact that these sort of texts become written down and become more canonical and recognizable and used to explain ritual practice. I'm working on writing this up now, so if people have thoughts, I'd be very interested. Okay, back to Azoria. So let's now focus on this late Archaic period, where we have, that's what most of the architecture you're seeing comes from. The site is suddenly abandoned around 480 BCE and intentionally, it seems like, dismantled, and some of the rooms were burned as well. What I can start doing is comparing assemblages across the site to get a sense of dining practices and how they differ at home versus in these kind of more civic structures, this communal dining building, the monumental civic building and whatnot, these larger complexes. So the first thing to note is that goats sort of dominate everywhere. If we break it across by room, all these rooms have at least 100 identifiable bones. The taxonomic profile looks the same. They're eating the same animals by and large at home and in these sort of more public civic feasts. Right. And so that's kind of boring. It's kind of annoying, actually. And what's also interesting, I think I took out that graph, is that the animals are the same age in both of these contexts as well. So it's pretty clear that by and large, the meat you eat at a larger gathering that is being hosted by the city-state is going to be fairly similar to the meat you eat at home. But one of the things we can tell that's different is butchery style. So cut marks on bone. A greater proportion of cut marks by far comes from those dumps I mentioned, these dumps of bone from the communal dining building. And so while the animals they eat might be pretty much the same, they're processing them and treating them in a very different manner. And so, as I mentioned, I can map out cut marks on the bone. And so one of the things you can tell is that most of these knife slices, where they're using a smaller knife, they're used to oftentimes take meat off the bone. They're used kind of in the middle of the shaft of these kind of long bones. But when we look at these cleaver chops, where they're chopping through a bone, right, rather than just leaving a slice on a bone, they're chopping through it intentionally, they all show up sort of in the same tight zone. So for example, I have 17 in this one zone on the pelvis, which is where the sort of thigh attaches to the hip. And they're all in this very tight zone. No other zone on the hind limbs has more than 4 examples of a chop. So it's clear that these sort of, for these larger scale feasts that are creating these animal remains in these large middens or dumps, they are using a different kind of butchery practice. And so this to me suggests that the individuals who are butchering these animals are probably, something more along the lines of what we'd think of as a professional butcher, though they might be priests. And that comes across in this sort of consistent way that they keep butchering these animals. And so if we think of them as priests, which we don't have any texts from Azoria, but other epigraphic texts on Crete from nearby at other sites mentions that butchers could be priests at times. It could be part of the spectacle as well. And then once these few chops are made, kind of at the hip, at the shoulder, and through the vertebra, where they sort of chop through the middle of the carcass, then you have the animal in larger joints, which you can then send off to the kitchens of the communal dining building, where they'd remove the meat mostly with knives. And so doing this has another further knock-on effect. They're being more efficient, more professional about preparing animals for these larger feasts. But it also will impact the kind of cuts of meat they have. As you sort of use different methods to process animals, whether it's a shift from stone tools to metal knives, or from metal knives to large cleavers, or to bandsaws, as can happen in the industrialized world today. It's going to create a different cut of meat. So even though they're eating the same animals, they're probably eating a different kind of dish that has different cuts of meat on it in these sort of communal feasts where they gather together in these larger complexes. And so just to kind of wrap up Azoria so I can move on to Athens and to some comparisons of texts, I just want to say Azoria is important because it's one of the few sites where we have a really large assemblage of animal remains, and they've all been excavated using modern methods. The size of the assemblage is unprecedented, and as I keep studying it, and we're going to get more reports from my colleagues on fish and small mammals and things like that, and birds, we can start asking more detailed questions about what the difference is between, say, sacrifice, which we all read about and know about, and what people are doing at home. And I think that's really important. So let's go back to the big picture for a second. And let's think about this sort of early Iron Age pattern. As I mentioned, it's kind of heterogeneous. And so it seems like different settlements adapted to their own local conditions, potentially in response to climate change, as we saw. Now, this pattern persists down into the historical period, into the Archaic through Hellenistic period. There's not a lot of animal bone studies, but it does seem as if there's not one sort of favored species, like in the late Bronze Age, where sheep were most common at most sites. And so I do wonder how this kind of heterogeneity in the management of animals, and how that ties into sort of the development of city-states. After all, city-states as a sort of form of governance was very regionalized and very different from settlement to settlement. And so that ties in very well with the kind of food production strategy and system that varies from settlement to settlement. If we start and zoom out to sanctuary record, we have a lot more animal bone studies from sanctuaries, though these don't provide a lot of resolution because usually it's those burned thighs. And so they don't really tell much other than a count of the number of burned thighs from different species. But you see that it's fairly heterogeneous across sanctuaries as well. Many of the patterns at sanctuaries oftentimes relates to which deity is being worshipped. So at many Poseidon sanctuaries, you see cattle as the most favored victim. At many Demeter or Persephone sanctuaries, you see pigs as the most common victim, and so on and so forth. And then others seem to be a little bit more random. But this heterogeneity is very prevalent in this period, and it fits in very well with the kind of polytheistic religion, the religious system that the Greeks practiced. Now we can start to compare this to our literary sources. And so this is something I'm working on right now as part of my project, my Zooarchaeology project. I'm trying to refine this, where I've used the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, which is an online database of ancient Greek literature. And I do searches for different lemma and lemmata, and look for different animal words. And then I have to double check always, because sometimes there's some overlap between, say, the declension creon of ram and how that can also be used to say Lord in the Bible. And I don't want to count all the Lord references. I want to count all the ram references. But I can start getting a count of animals in ancient Greek literature, because after all, zooarchaeology is very much a quantitative study. And so to be able to compare it directly with textual sources, there's lots of different ways we can do that, but it's nice to be able to start looking at it quantitatively, sort of on the same level playing field. And so when I start to count up animals in Greek literary sources, what I see is that ancient Greek literature mostly mentions cattle. They really like cattle. You see how prevalent they are with these yellow bars. And this is really interesting, because that just doesn't really compare well with our animal bone evidence, where cattle are very rarely the most common animal at most settlements, and at most sanctuaries for that matter. Just a few sanctuaries are cattle the most common animal specimen in the assemblage. So when I found out this picture, I went and took to Twitter, and I asked my friends on Twitter for pictures of cows, because I thought I could spice up a lecture like this with some lovely pictures of cows. And I got a few really legitimately nice looking pictures of cows. But to be honest, it didn't really work. It was not quite like my goat query. Most of the pictures I got were kind of like this. And it's a nice picture of cows, but it's not that kind of, cattle are just, they're not as photogenic as goats. And I think there's a lesson here, because goats are all over the internet. Like cats, goats are everywhere because goats are really dang cute, right? They're very photogenic. Everybody loves goats. And so they post them all over the internet, and everybody, when they travel to Greece or elsewhere, they photograph the goats, not the cows. And so there's a good reason for this. And there's a good reason. This is why every year you go online and you see some stupid article that tells us how the goats have taken over the internet, because they're posted everywhere. Goat pictures, goat GIFs are a known phenomenon, right? But, and I mean, come on, we all understand why, right? But this doesn't relate to what people eat. Most people aren't eating goats, despite the fact that many of us might share goat pictures on Facebook or Twitter. At least in the US, when I started to look this up last. Am I reading this right? Yeah, beef was the most common animal, and more recently, chickens have overtaken it. You can see this rise in chicken consumption since the 1950s. And it's interesting because doing a search of English literature using Google Ngram searches, you can see as well, it sort of reflects this sort of meat consumption. Chickens overtake mentions of beef in English texts, English books, prior to them overtaking beef in our diet. But at the same time, at least up in the US, but at the same time, there is a trend that relates to literature versus what we're eating. But that's not the case in the past. In these sort of literary sources in ancient Greece, they're talking about cattle, but they're mostly eating sheep and goat. And so I think some of this might relate to this sort of internet phenomenon of the goats. After all, these literary sources that we have are somewhat biased. They're produced by elite individuals of ancient Greece and meant to be read by other elite individuals. And you can understand cattle are much larger than these other animals, and they feed many more people, and they're going to be more honorary for the deities that they're worshiping. And so you could understand why they talk a lot more about cattle than those sheep and goat. In fact, goats are oftentimes referred to in a kind of negative sense. They smell and things like that. There, people get made fun of in various comedies. And they're very pejorative, even though, of course, the ancient Greeks ate a lot of goats. So let's move back from literature down and let's zoom in on the Athenian Agora. The group of remains I've studied from here, about 5,000 identifiable bones from a much larger total number. It's been excavated really since the 1930s by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And so a lot of the collections were done not using modern methods, though I did have access to more recently excavated material that had been sieved, but no flotation. So there's no real good evidence for fish or rodents or things like that, hair, but mostly larger animals. And we have to take it all with a grain of salt. So Athens is one of those sites where in the early Iron Age, there's a lot of goats. By the Archaic period and into the Classical period, there seems to be a more even representation of animals, these four main taxa: cattle, pig, sheep, and goat, within this space, which is interesting. But across the site, in the Archaic period, these look again to be fairly homogeneous. There is this exception with more sheep, but by and large, there's this fairly similar taxonomic composition in different deposits throughout the area of the Athenian Agora during the Archaic period, which is cool. We saw that at Azoria. Across Azoria, it's sort of all the same, the taxonomic composition. And to be honest, at most Greek sites, it looks like this. Not many of them are published, but most of them have a similar taxonomic composition across the site, which suggests to me that animal remains might represent this kind of smear of trash, where different activities are being smeared together within what we think of as single assemblages. But this all changes in the Classical period in the Athenian Agora. The deposits that we have, mostly from wells that have been filled in, they now show more heterogeneity and less homogeneity in terms of their taxonomic composition. Different animals are the most common, and you can tell these compositions look very, very different across these different deposits. And so what I think is going on is, as Athens grows and this area becomes the Agora of ancient Athens, we see the impact of urbanism on the city and how people live in it. And many of these well deposits, after a well is abandoned, it gets filled with refuse. They derive from large deposits of trash that represent one commercial, sacrificial, or otherwise activity that ended up creating large layers in these wells that were no longer homogeneous, everything lumped together, but in fact fairly unique structured deposits, like all the burned sheep and goat thighs and tails from the altar of Aphrodite at Oronea, or the several wells that are filled with refuse from horn and bone working, where they carefully saw through this to be able to extract bony material in order to create styluses or pins or combs, or we don't actually have a lot of finished material from these workshops, or rather from the trash from these workshops, but some that were in progress, as you can see. We also have butchery refuse. I think I've identified a couple wells that derive from butcher shops in the Agora. We have these very structured deposits. They're all butchered in the same way, and the bones join together. They articulate, which suggests that they were filled rapidly, all from sort of the same source, which is pretty fascinating. And so if we focus on butchery for a second, I really like butchery. I'm sorry for all of you vegetarians here. I study I study ancient food trash. So over time, cleaver butchery, remember I mentioned that at Azoria, cleavers chopping through a bone, becomes much more common. And butchery marks themselves become more common as well in the Athenian Agora over time. This probably just relates to cleaver butchery when you're butchering with a knife and you don't really want to leave a slice on the bone because that dulls your blade. But on the other hand, if you're chopping with a cleaver, you're actually intentionally chopping into or through a bone. So it makes sense when cleaver butchery takes off, you see more bones with butchery marks. And when we start mapping out these butchery marks across the anatomy of these animals, we get a sense again of the sort of professionalization of this craft. So for example, we all, as I explained to you, oftentimes the thigh bone could be burned in sacrificial ritual. And interestingly enough, none of our thigh bones from the Athenian Agora have a single knife slice left on them. And we have many that were unburned, so they never ended up on an altar being burned, but the butchers were careful and didn't leave a single knife slice on any cattle thigh bones. They did on pig and sheep and goat thigh bones. This is only cattle. And they left very, very few cleaver chops on them as well. Almost all of them come from kind of the ball of the hip that fits into the socket. And so what they're doing there is they're sort of chopping through the ball of the hip joint, and that ball now becomes part of the hip, part of the pelvis. And then the thigh bone itself is probably carefully removed. And many of these butchers thought that most of them will be burned. Of course, we have a lot of them that were not burned. But they seem to be making sure to leave fewer cut marks on these thigh bones than on other bones of cattle or of other animals. We can start looking more closely by plotting this out anatomically to understand different cuts of meat as well, which I'm really fascinated in. And so we can start to see how something like a fairly large sheep or goat pelvis, something that's about the size of my face, let's say, in terms of the bone with the meat even larger, we can see multiple chops on it to break it down into kind of portion size bits that you could fit into a stew pot, which I think is fascinating. We can start to see the creation of these cuts of meat. And at other times, I can start to get in even more detail. I have these pig shoulders and pig jaws and a couple dog shoulders and dog jaws because they eat dog in ancient Greece. It's not super common, but they do eat it. I have butchered dog remains like this jaw right here from every site I've ever studied. But these shoulder blades and pig jaws are all treated really interestingly. Many of the shoulder blades have a hole right here, which could be from putting a hook into the shoulder to cure it. And you have to look really closely, but each of these has 5, sometimes up to 10 slices on the underside of the shoulder blade, or multiple slices coming down the jawbone, these pig cheekbones. And the pig cheekbones are further chopped through into small little portion sizes. And so what I think is going on here, and like I said, it's almost entirely going on with shoulders and cheeks of pigs and occasionally dog, is that these are cured pieces of meat. So you could think about curing pork shoulder, either salting it or smoking it or drying it. You could do the same thing with pig cheek. You could think about guanciale for that. And so the reason why is once you cure meat, it shrinks, it loses moisture, and it's attached more tightly to the bone. And that would explain the 5, 6, 7 slices that I have on the underside of these scapulae. They're very fine, or these, for example, that are coming through these sort of mandible fragments. And the mandibles in particular, the cheek must have been even more of a delicacy because they chop it into thirds or half. And so that's kind of fascinating to be able to see. And we can take this a step further because the teeth can also tell us about the age and the sex of these pigs. And so what's really cool is that the butchered pigs in the Athenian Agora, the ones that have this style of butchery, are predominantly older, and they're predominantly females, while the unbutchered pig jaws are younger males. And that makes a lot of sense because you're going to keep females alive longer because you can use them to breed as you're breeding sows. And so they'll end up being larger and have more meat and are therefore more, I guess, better to cure their cheeks and their shoulders. And so putting all these sort of details together, their ages of slaughter, their canines, which show whether they're male or female, and then linking it to these kind of butchery styles gives us a sense of very precise sort of meals, I guess, or cuts of meat, servings of meat in the city of Athens. So one of my big goals, as I've mentioned, is to fit this in with other forms of evidence. And it's at Athens I can start to do that in a little more detail. How do we sort of contextualize these changes in butchery with the developments in the Agora sort of at this time? And so one of the things we can note if we start looking at the ceramic assemblage is large pithoi. So pithoi, they're storage jars that are larger than me, larger than you. They could fit 2 of us in one of them. They're used for storing, agricultural produce or other things that you store in large quantities. They almost disappear from the area around the Athenian Agora between the Archaic and then to the Classical and on down. And so this suggests to me that people are no longer storing as much food at home and they're frequenting the marketplace. Because it's a big question, how often do people go to just buy their food from the marketplace? Well, certainly those that live near and around the Athenian Agora, they seem to stop storing large quantities of food in their houses. And those of these large vessels that are around later on, they're only used for industrial purposes, like they're full of marble chips at sculpture workshops and things like that. As well, we can start to track changes in sort of cook pots. So in the Archaic period, so, the 6th century BCE, there's really only one type of cook pot found in Athens. It's this big sort of soup pot. You can't even put a lid on it. At least it's not designed to have a tight fitting lid on it. And so there aren't many different ways to cook with that. But by the start of the 5th century BCE, a new type is introduced called a lidded kitra. Same sort of form. It's a big stew pot, but it can take a lid, which will let you do things like stews. And then by the end of the 5th century, a third cook pot is introduced called a lopas. It's smaller, and many of them start having a flat bottom, and you could use that for braising or for frying even. And so we can see sort of this elaboration of cuisine as this city is growing and becoming more prosperous and becoming more urban in its own nature. And so I tend to think that these changes in butchery, this move towards cleaver butchery, which is much more efficient, and then the different cuts of meat that they're creating with their cleavers and knives, it goes hand in hand with these changes that we see elsewhere for changes in food practices and diet in Athens. And to some degree, this manifests itself in skeletal remains. So you can do, again, dietary isotopes of human remains to get a sense of how much animal protein they're consuming. And by and large, everybody's consuming fairly similar amounts of animal protein. And it's a fairly high amount compared to other sites earlier in the Greek world and also later. Some of the isotope signatures that Animalia here in Athens published were some of the highest in the pre-modern world, actually. At the time of publication. Maybe that's changed. And so probably some of this relates to sacrifice. We certainly have sacrificial calendars. We have a good record of the Athenians making large numbers of sacrifices. I'm interested in seasonal changes, but I feel like I've gone on for too long, so I want to wrap this up. But what's interesting is that maybe we can start to get a better sense of what's going on by looking at this literature where cattle are mentioned a lot, as I discussed earlier. And so maybe that has to do with the fact that cattle are prized for sacrifice. And we know this when we look at counts of animals on Athenian vases. So Attic vases, this count was made by Volker van Straten. He went through thousands of Athenian vases and counted the animals on them. And cattle are by far the most common animal represented. But when we go to documentary evidence, inscriptions, the Attic calendars, sacrificial calendars from Dean sites and Tritis and elsewhere in the Attic rural hinterland, these are actually dominated by sheep. And so this seems to be more of a reflection of the zooarchaeological record. And so just like earlier on in the lecture, I was talking about the linear B tablets, which represent documentary evidence in the late Bronze Age. Same is true of these sacrificial calendars. It's a receipt of what was consumed when at these different for these different cults in Attica. And so they're telling a more truthful picture of what people did rather than the literary sources or the artistic representations that relates more clearly with what we have in the zooarchaeological record from the animal bones themselves. And so I always like to kind of compare. It's great that Facebook's down because I tend to think that when we look at kind of an Athenian vase painting or we read a work of literature, that is elite individuals trying to present themselves as they want to be presented, much like how we post nice photos of ourselves on Facebook for our family and friends. We don't post ourselves in bed eating Cheetos while watching Netflix. No, we post ourselves looking much nicer and having fun at the beach or something like that. But at the same time, what we do is revealed from our trash. And so the animal bone record is a good record of the kind of trash that people leave behind. It's a plentiful record from archaeological sites. And as long as we do what it's taken to collect these remains properly with sieving and flotation and making sure that we have storage space for them so that different researchers can study things, I think we'll be able to say a lot more about the ancient world animals in the past and how they relate to animals that we see and know so well from textual sources and artistic sources. So I hope you'll bear with me for just 2 minutes. I just want to quickly introduce my new project, which I just started last month. It's called Zooarchaeology. I'm basically expanding the work that I've done at Azoria to a few different sites, which includes Knossos, post-Minoan Knossos, Chrysos, Ethanos, Halosmenos. I'm hoping to find a few others as well to try to look at in more detail the differences between civic dining, residential dining, and sort of commercial processing of animals. And as well, I have funding through my Marie Curie fellowship to do some more scientific methods to be able to look at a few different questions. I'll be working hopefully with Taylor Hermes of Max Planck Institute at Leipzig to look at the ancient DNA of some, and specifically we're going to use Azoria for most of these studies because we have such detail with where these animals are found in houses, in civic dining structures. While the taxonomic composition might be the same, it might be that different herds are supplying the animals that are consumed in civic feasts versus at home. And so using ancient DNA, since oftentimes there's only a few male breeding stock, we can actually start to pick apart different herds at Azoria and see if they're being consumed at different places. But I'm doubly excited for the isotope evidence that I'll be able to get from these teeth. From sheep and goat. Specifically, I'm hoping to start providing some direct data that can answer what many scholars have called the agro-pastoral debate. And so the question is if you go to Greece today, you see herders moving their sheep and goat up and down seasonally. So they sort of go up into the uplands during the summer, and then they go into the lowlands during the winter. And we can start to get at that with isotope signatures from their teeth. Sheep and goat teeth, the teeth basically preserve the signatures, the isotopic signatures of the water they're drinking and of the food they're eating at the time the teeth were growing. And so we can use things like strontium isotope ratios, nitrogen and carbon isotope ratios to understand what these sheep and goat were eating and drinking and the landscape that they're in. Strontium captures the geological signature of the underlying bedrock that the water table absorbs, while nitrogen and carbon relate to the type of plants and different things that are being fed to these sheep and goat, whether it's pasture, whether it's agricultural crops that were grown. These are the kinds of questions we can start to answer. And then we can sort of piece it all together using oxygen isotopes by taking multiple samples across a single tooth. Oxygen relates to the water that the animal is absorbing, and in different seasons, different types of precipitation, they have different oxygen signatures. So by taking multiple samples on a tooth, I can start looking at the different diet and landscape that these sheep and goat were herded in during the summer months versus the winter months, and to start having a better sense of how these animals were managed within the landscape around them. And so that can help us better track, were these animals moving long distance? Were maybe the ones that were consumed at the civic dining building, were they from a larger herd that's moved long distance, while those that are consumed at home, those are just from the few animals that some farmer owns? We don't know, but that's the kinds of questions that I'm hoping to be able to get at with this project, as well as expanding on my textual analysis and hands-on animal bone analysis. So I want to thank you all. I guess I'll end with a few of my favorite goat pictures, because I have some really nice goat pictures and cow pictures as well. I always want to save the best for last, and you can think of a few questions as I end. This goat looks like he's Zeus in goat form, doesn't he? That's what I've always thought. And that's a good one from my colleague in Romania. And that's it. All right, I'll stop my share. Any questions from anyone? I went a little long, but thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Finn, for this talk. I'm really impressed, and I'm sure that all of us are really impressed here. So I will open the floor for questions. I have some myself, but I will keep them for later, so I can the opportunity for others.
I have some questions. So I guess one is with the word searches and the literary evidence, have you been able to try like coding any of those by context, like sacrificial versus living animal versus whatever else?
I have for some text. That's what I'm hoping to get better, go back to the data set and get better evidence for. I want to, in particular, I'm really interested in ages as well. And so I that's my goal. Most of them were live animals or sacrificed, and so that's kind of the only context that at least these four species are mentioned in, by and large. Occasionally they're products, like somebody talking about like a sheep garment, or cheese or something like that. But yeah, most of the time they seem to be referring to either sacrifices or live animals that are being raised. But no, I've not broken it apart that way yet. That's one of my next steps. Yeah, so it's a good question.
And also, when you were talking about birds and fish and small mammals, do you have any sort of preliminary comments on that yet, or how unique is that you have actually looked for those and taken those as part of your excavation?
Yeah, so that's the big problem, is you need to do flotation. And flotation is a really time-consuming process. Basically what it is, that's how you get plant remains as well. So you take a sample, just a sample of the soil you're excavating, and you throw it in a flotation tank, which has a pump at the bottom. And so what that does is it causes the carbonized seeds of plants to float up to the top and sort of drain off. And that's really useful, so you can start doing the same thing I'm doing with plants. But then everything that sinks to the bottom, which most of it is little rocks, of course, but a bunch of it is also bones of rodents, birds, and fish. And so you need to sit there and sort that out, because there's so many little gravelly pieces of rock. It takes hours. So it's a time-consuming and arduous process, and that's why a lot of excavations have not been doing it. And I find this to be very problematic, especially if we're digging in a foreign country, because we should be doing everything we can to save what we can. And so I'm a strong proponent of it, but it's catching on slowly in the classical period of Greece. It's now par for the course elsewhere in Europe. It's par for the course in most Roman contexts elsewhere in Europe, but it's par for the course in prehistoric sites earlier in Greece. But for the historical period, it's been catching on slowly. So there's not nearly as much to say for these periods. For fish, specifically Dimitra Milona, she is actually studying the fish remains from Azoria, and she has a nice book on fish remains throughout the Greek world. And then for small mammals, there's very little that's been published. But Katerina Papayani has a 3-year postdoc to study the small mammals from Azoria. So I don't have a ton to say. I can tell you that there's no chicken. I'm sure of that because chickens don't really get introduced to the Greek world until the first millennium BC. And the only chicken that I've seen so far from Azoria is from Hellenistic contexts, so a little later. And I can tell you that they consumed a lot of hair. So not the hair on my head, but like, not like a rabbit, but a hair. And so there's a lot of hair bones from Azoria. And actually that's something I'm working on right now. They butcher them. They even turn them sometimes into bone tools. But yeah, so there's a debate whether that qualifies as a small mammal or not. So me and Katerina agreed to split that in two, which is why I'm working on it right now. But yeah, so there will be more coming on that. They certainly consumed a lot of hair, and this is probably not worth saying since it's being recorded. But if I remember right, we have this storage structure, and the counts of small mammal bones were higher in that civic store building, where they were storing a lot of grain and different sort of plant remains. And so that could suggest that that's where sort of rodents were, commensal rodents were gathering to steal food from humans. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, more to come. But on that note also, since zooarchaeology is such a specialized topic and I came at it from classics, a lot of European zooarchaeologists, they divide up what they study into different groups of animals. So I specifically focus on sort of medium and larger sized mammals. So I find other people to study the fish and the rodents and the birds, if possible.
Great. I think Andrea had a question, or?
I was going to say that a lot of my questions have already been answered. The great question I had, you touched on, Flint, right at the end. I was reading both of the papers you so graciously provided for us. And one of the questions I had was, are we sure that maybe there was not a difference in the herds that were providing maybe the animals for the settlements and for the altars? And I had a question and you kind of answered. You're thinking about it, so you're gonna go for it, maybe.
Yeah.
And you can talk more about it if you want. But that was a big question that I had. I had no idea how you'd answer that, so you told us already.
Well, that's the tricky thing, and that's what made this so many of the sites I've studied shock me, was the lack of sort of spatial difference across a site in animal remains. And the same when I track down published sources, and it's annoying. You want to find all this diversity within the archaeological record that can answer these questions, and when you get back the same sort of animals and the same ages and the same sexes, this is a similar distribution of those across the site, it becomes very frustrating. And so yeah, so that's why I found funding to sort of try to get a better sense of how these animals were being managed. So, you could imagine that the slaughter pattern might be the same for, say, some household herd and some civic herd. And that's why we have sort of similar compositions and similar ages, but they might be managed differently. So a larger herd of animals, they might herd them more long distance, or they might feed them differently. And so we can start to look at that. And we can also start to look at the genetic composition to see if they're related and how closely related these different herds are. So yeah, that's the first step. But at the same time, we could also imagine that it's the citizens themselves that are contributing basically what they eat at home for food anyway, to the common mess, right? So for the public good. And so it very much well might be that there might not be any differentiation at all. And so I don't really know. I think the dig director wants me to come up with the second option. I think he's convinced of that, but I'll wait and see what the results show. I'm open either way, and I could see both as being as being likely. Let's say they're both good hypotheses. Yeah. So the other thing that, if you picked up from my paper that I didn't bring up here, was that most of the bones that had been gnawed by dogs, or rather a higher proportion of assemblages that had dog gnawing, came from the kitchens of the communal dining building. And so I don't really have a great explanation for it, other than dogs were able to get into the kitchens there. But that might also suggest that they had enough food that they could more freely share bones with the dogs that were around. So that also gives a slight indication of something different between a public feast versus a meal at home. But yeah, it's a good question, and it's tough to answer, isn't it?
And I had another curiosity. It's not really a curiosity. I don't know if you have that kind of answer. You talked a lot about the middens when you were in your paper. I was wondering what kind of time scale of accumulation you're talking about. If you have that kind of answer, are we talking about single events, or I don't know, a few years, a few weeks, or are we talking about a continuous gradual accumulation throughout the whole time of settlement, that time of settlement, 600, 480? Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have a hypothesis, or are you sure of time scale accumulation? Not all of the assemblages, yes, but I was particularly interested in the middens.
Yeah, they're difficult to answer as well. I'm gonna have to wait till the ceramicist can give me more information on the different micro layers she has, because it was excavated very carefully in fairly small units across these middens, and observing different stratigraphic changes. But we didn't have a micromorphologist, so we don't have any micromorphology, geoarchaeology approaches to be able to answer that. What I can say is that the middens come from abandoned rooms of the building. So the building was larger at one point, and then a few of the dining rooms, or halls as we call them, were abandoned, and they became the middens. They seem to mostly be in the eastern portion of this building. And so what that means is we can be sure that, the earliest date of them is not the earliest use of the structure. So it comes from the latter part of that structure's use life, let's say. But yeah, the bones in them are way too fragmented. I do have a few articulations, but I think they come from the same layer or adjacent layers, and those would have been excavation things. So I don't think I have much evidence from the animal bones themselves to answer your question. But they should date fairly tightly to the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC, at a minimum.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to have a geoarchaeologist. It'd be nice.
I don't want to hog the questions, so maybe I'll have something later.
Sure.
So more questions? So I'll bring one maybe uneducated question, but I'm really curious about it. So we had this big discussion about sacrifices, and that the animals should go voluntarily to the sacrifice, nodding their way to death. And Naiden showed us that maybe we're just like misreading our sources and the vases, that they were not like really nodding, but people are trying to take a look if they have this vivacity and are fit to be sacrificed. And I was wondering if it would be possible with any of this methods, especially DNA and teeth, to get a hint if animals are getting slaughtered under a lot of stress or at no stress at all. Because, if we look at meat today, after we slaughter an animal, you can tell from the meat quality if it was a lot of stress there or not. And I would like to know if it's possible to do that with bones or teeth.
I don't think so, is the answer. One of the things I'm hoping to do, I'm going to collaborate with Sterling Wright at Penn State University, is some of these animals have dental calculus still on their teeth. And so we can sample the dental calculus for DNA to get a sense of what's called the oral microbiome. So, we have all kinds of creatures living in our mouths. Not creatures, bacteria and whatever. And so we can actually analyze that from dental calculus from humans and animals. I can't imagine how that would be impacted from the stress of the animal. it's certainly no other way could I think of could get that across, but I'm just not sure. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, you sort of get this sense from a few different sacrificial rituals that they probably tried to do it in some way where they weren't stressing the animal. And like you said, it tastes different. So I think it's a logical inference that they would be good about that. But yeah, I don't know how to test that with the bones and the teeth per se. Yeah.
That would be a nice final answer for this polemic.
I wish, sorry. They only say what they can say.
Yeah.
I will say that I like am looking at the same time period as Flint, but I also included Cyprus in my research, and like we can tell stress only if we have like a full animal assemblage in excavation. So like if you guys haven't heard of Salamis on Cyprus before, I would recommend looking up the horse burial pictures there, because you can tell by the way the body's like articulated in the excavation unit that it was under like a severe amount of stress. But like that's the only like time that really I can think about it. It's very rare to actually see that.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be from consumed animals either.
No,
that
not
would be, yeah, that would be more
ritual.
from like a full burial.
Burial.
Yeah, just ritual.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my second undecided question would be if it would be possible to make some kind of projection of how like an average habitant of Azoria would consume in terms of meat and non-meat food, like in the caloric, or I don't know if you can say like 20%, 30% of the caloric consumed would be from meat and the rest from cereals or other materials. Is it possible to make a projection like this, looking at Azoria?
If you have human remains, which we don't from that period, we have earlier human remains. But from the periods that I discussed, we don't have any human remains, so we can't do that. Just having counts of animal bones versus seeds doesn't really tell you realistically how much of each they ate. Comparing plants and animals, I can certainly, I think, given the number of samples we have, I can start talking about the relationship between different types of animals, as I've argued. But yeah, between animals and plants, you really need human remains, and you'd want to do carbon and nitrogen isotope analyses on them to answer that question. But yeah, we don't have the cemetery from that period, so we can't right now. Yeah, it shows why having like different cross sections of the same settlement can really help. You know, settlement, cemetery, sanctuary. Being able to try to put all that together is the best way to be able to answer a lot of these questions, to be honest. Yeah. Good question. All good questions so far. And good comment from Alina.
I have one more. It's not really a question, it's more like a favor.
Okay.
What would you like tell to some young classicist or ancient historian if they want to pursue like the way of zooarchaeology, especially from areas of that not America and Europe, like South America? What can you do? Like there is some program online that you can attend, or there how to get into excavation, or how was your path to do it? I don't know. I'm really interested because we don't have many possibilities here, but it's nice to hear if someone has this interest to pursue it more professionally.
Yeah, it's a real problem even in the US. Because in the US, I'm not sure how it works in Brazil, but in the US, archaeology is kind of divided between classical archaeology and anthropological archaeology, and they exist in different departments. What that means is there really aren't people that bridge this divide. There's a few, but they're mostly younger, just finishing up their PhD or have recently finished up their PhD. Europe, on the other hand, has more combined archaeology departments. And so that's why I had to go to Sheffield to get training in how to answer these questions, because in the US, most of the zooarchaeology that's taught is zooarchaeology of hunter-gatherer societies. And so it's much different from the zooarchaeology of, say, settled communities and the kinds of questions that you'd ask, right? And so, yeah, it's really difficult. You definitely do need hands-on training. So you get in touch with zooarchaeologists that you read and send them an email, see if you can join them on a project. because you're not, just like studying pottery, it's tough to do without getting a hands-on feel for them. But certainly even getting a feel from working on local projects in Brazil, it might be a different set of animals, though maybe post-colonial, it would be some similar animals. Will give you that sense of experience looking at some of these animal bones and how to do that. And so it's about thinking about how to reach across this divide from humanities and classics towards archaeological science, and how to get us to speak together, because there is this divide. You can see this in both the ways that historians deal with scientific data and in the ways that scientists deal with historical data. And so it's a challenge that exists, trying to reach across that divide. But I certainly hope that more people will, and I know more people are, because I think it's valuable to have both approaches. They both can answer different questions, and they can complement each other if you have somebody that understands both of those data sets. So I highly encourage reaching out to faculty in different departments. Would probably be the first step. Yeah, and then emailing people. Yeah, there are short courses. The University of Sheffield, the archaeology department, just advertised actually their short courses. They're one-day courses. They cost a little bit of money at, I forget how much, 50, 60 euros or pounds, I guess. But I think they offer discounts and stuff like that, so you could get in touch. And they're like one-day courses that look at like sort of, they're useful for, say, a historian that wants to get a sense of how to analyze published animal bones. So I think the next one looks at socioeconomic status. Another one will look at hunting. Another one will look at, different kinds of questions. How can we use the animal bone record to start to answer these questions? And so their short courses are really good. Let's just hope their department sticks around for longer than we think right now. But yeah.
Great, thank you. Mm-hmm. So more questions.
You asked the question, I was going to ask about the. I had a broader question to Flynn. I was curious about your training as a whole. How did you get in the area? Did you get into the classics already thinking about zooarchaeology? Did you have a whole education as a classes before joining zooarchaeology? What departments did you go to? And I'd like to say, I think I talked to Pedro about the Sheffield program. We talked about it a few days ago, I think. So yeah, I like Sheffield. I follow them on Instagram. I'm always rooting for them.
Yeah, of course. Yes. Do you have more that you want me to talk to, or?
No, I would like you to talk to us about your training as a whole.
Yeah, sure. Path. So my path is weird. My dad was a Paleolithic archaeologist, and he studied stone tools. And so that's why my name is Flint, and my brother's name is Chip. And so my dad was a little crazy. He was a great guy. But I did not want to be an archaeologist at all growing up, but I went on a few of his digs here and there, and I learned he was really into digital archaeology. His claim to fame is he was the first archaeologist to use a total station to shoot in an artifact. And he wrote a lot of software. He had total stations to be able to map out archaeological sites. So I learned that from him, but I didn't really want to be an archaeologist. And then I went to university at Penn, and I started taking a lot of history courses. So I eventually realized I needed to focus, and I realized I like classics. And so I focused on the Greek and Roman history. In fact, my undergrad thesis, you could probably see how it relates. It was on narcotic plants in ancient Greco-Roman magic spells from the Papyri Magicae Graecae. And so that was what started getting me into, I guess, plants and stuff like that. And then when I went to grad school, at some point I realized I wanted to actually be an archaeologist, and I was glad that I chose classics because it would be in a different field than what my dad was in. But as I started going on digs in the Greek and Roman world, I realized that people weren't studying the animal bones. And so that sort of shocked me. I sort of said, wait a second, why is nobody studying this? These are 2,000-year-old animal bones. They can tell us something. And I started becoming more into food. And so it just sort of all clicked as I finished my master's and started my PhD. someone had shared my master's thesis with Paul Halstead at Sheffield. And he said, yeah, get him over here. Nobody that I ever train wants to study historical Greece. They all want to study the Neolithic because that's what he mostly studies. And so it'd be great to have a student that studies historical Greece. And so then my department, I petitioned them for funds to go and study there for a semester. And that's how I got my animal bone training. And since then, I haven't looked back. I mean, all my degrees are actually in classical studies, classical history or civilization, and classical archaeology. But it was that interlude right in the middle. It made for a very long PhD process because I sort of had to master two fields. But since I was doing something different, I was able to raise money from different funding bodies, which helped as well. I mean, doing what I do, it sucks because there's no jobs that advertise for what I do. The number of jobs I've seen that have asked for somebody that does classical Greek zooarchaeology in my 5 years on the market is zero. And but at the same time, I have more offers to study material than I can deal with because there's very few people that do what I do. And so there's this weird conflicting issue in how our departments are defined at a university level versus what needs to happen at a research level. And so, and at a training level as well, to be able to get people to do these kind of things. And so it really shows the problems with how universities are structured, and the ways we need to fight for a more interdisciplinary approach to all of what we do. Because these divides between the sciences and the arts, it's all imaginary. It's all created in the last 200 years. And so, you know, we need to think about how to break down those divides and how we can stop fighting against each other for the limited resources that exist in a university and try to work together to, you know, get people that have more funds like certain science departments to support studies of history from a scientific point of view and vice versa. And so, you know, but it's hard. It's not easy. And I don't know what's going to happen with the several of us that are coming up to do this kind of thing right now. There are homes for people that do this for like Neolithic or Indigenous America studies, but there isn't really that for people that do this for classical Greece. And so we'll have to see. Yeah. But it does make for attractive funding requests when you can say that this is some of the first things. So that's one way where you can find support, because I've been reasonably successful at getting grants and fellowships and things like that to pay for me to live and eat and stuff like that, and to travel and whatever. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thanks so much for sharing. It's really nice to hear.
If you hear of an opening for a zooarchaeologist in classical Greece, tell me.
Maybe in Brazil.
Yeah, sure. I got to go to the International Conference of Archaeozoology in Argentina back in 2014. So
nice.
Me and my wife had a good time in South America.
Great.
I can tell you that the field of zooarchaeology as a whole, slowly, but gradually in South America, but mostly in Argentina, a little bit in Uruguay, but Uruguay is very limited. And maybe, I don't know, in years to come, it will blow up in Brazil. But it's very, very slow here. I know one person who calls herself a zooarchaeologist here, professionally, just one. But maybe it will blow up, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that needs to be studied, and you can start asking new questions. So hopefully. Yeah, I've met several Argentinians, not just from the conference, but at other conferences as well. But I didn't realize in Brazil it's not as common.
Well, I know very few. I think a few of them don't even know to call themselves archaeologists. They don't even know that's a possibility. But I know one person who's very aware of what she's doing, the questions, of the differences. She's very young, so it's a very young field here. Well, but Argentina, as usual, is light years ahead of us in that department.
These things always happen. Here, wait. I'm gonna find you the email address of the listserv. I'll type it in there. There's no, 1 second. There we go.
Pedro, if you have an interest well, it's not classical, but USP sometimes organizes digs in Minas Gerais, in the Lagoa Santa, and being where we are, they always need hands and brains. So if you can pay your way, I think that
I can bring
will
the
accept
hands.
you. But yeah,
If you all,
sorry.
I was going
No?
to say, if you all look up the Zooarchaeology listserv, and it's open to join for anybody, historians, paleontologists, or anyone who's interested in zooarchaeology. It's a really friendly listserv by and large. I've heard tales of other academic listservs. This one's very friendly and supportive. The people are always open to questions, and they share articles, and it's a really valuable resource. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in absorbing some more zooarchaeology and reading about it and seeing what zooarchaeologists argue about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, so do you have more questions? Or comments?
Did you all like the goat pictures?
They're
Very
great.
much so.
Really good.
But you didn't have a picture of one of them impaled on a fence because it failed to make it the jump over it, which is something that low-key traumatized me when I was in Crete. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, no, it's so, oh, and then I realized it was impaled.
I didn't catch it on time. I have a cute picture of a goat in the Sun Island, Ilha del Sol, in Bolivia. But I didn't see it on time. It's a very cute picture. It's got the beautiful background and everything. And I have a very ugly cattle picture, very normal ranch-like. I could provide you with both, a very scenic one and a very horrid one.
And notice that the goat one is scenic and the cow one isn't.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, it's exactly that.
Yeah, email them to me. I'd be happy to.
I'm gonna look for
Add
them.
it to my list. I insist on only using pictures that people have like personally given me. People that when I ask that call, they keep like linking me to like news articles with goat pictures, and I'm like, no, I want your pictures, not like someone else's.
I'll find them. I'll mail them to you. It's very personal. It's got a badly cropped foot appearing right at the end. It's very personal. Very much not a professional picture.
That's okay.
Very nice. So yeah, next month we're going to read another paper, now more like human anthropology, about monks that are not supposed to eat meat, but now we can look at their bones. They are eating meat somehow. So we're going to discuss these people who are unveiled 1,000 years later. And
Nice.
I would like to thank you, Flint, again. It was really nice. I really enjoyed it. It was amazing. And thank you everybody who came here. And I will forward you the recording from here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think I would just upload it somewhere and I will send you the link and we can see what we do with that. If you want to put it on your YouTube channel, for me, it's great.
Yeah, I might as well. Yeah.
Nice.
I'll probably cut out the discussion, but just, or maybe just a little bit of it.
Perfect. And we'll see what we do here because we don't have a YouTube channel, in fact, but at least for our list, we're going to circulate this talk so people can also get a bit of it. And
sounds good to me. It was great to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope to see you again at some point.
Yeah, I hope so too. I'm not traveling as much with COVID, but yeah, it was good to meet you all. And if you ever have a question, or you want to get in touch with a zooarchaeologist about something, or you're thinking about a student or yourself, shoot me an email. I'll do my best to try to help out. Yeah.
That's very nice.
Thanks all. Thanks, okay. Animalia.
So thank you. Let's make a picture so that we're here.
Sure, yeah.
Why not? Will be better with a beautiful goat, but okay. Okay, so that's it. 3, 2, 1.
Let's see.
Okay, so I'll send this later. Okay, so see you next month. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye.